Hello everyone, my name is Cody Waldrop. Welcome to my presentation on the Grand Coulee Dam, which I picked because it's near where I grew up. I remember driving past it as a kid. They do light shows on it, as you can see here, light displays, concerts, things like that. So it was always interesting to me when I was growing up. We're going to talk about the location of the dam, why it was built, the impact that the dam has had, and some learning points. Interestingly enough, it is considered the eighth wonder of the world, self-titled, but it does have its own seal that you can see down there on the bottom right. So this is a dam that was constructed 90 years ago. It began in the early 1930s and was completed in 1941 to 1942 along the Columbia River in Washington State. The National Parks Services notes, quote, "The Grand Coulee Dam on the Columbia River west of Spokane, Washington, is one of the largest structures ever built by mankind. A mass of concrete standing 550 feet high and 5,223 feet long, or just shy of a mile. Grand Coulee contains 12 million cubic yards of concrete, or enough to build a highway from Seattle to Miami. More massive than the Great Pyramid of Giza, Grand Coulee is listed by the American Society of Civil Engineers as one of the 7 civil engineering wonders of the United States. Grand Coulee's reservoir, Franklin D. Roosevelt Lake, stretches 150 miles north, almost to the Canadian border." Now, like most hydroelectric dams, its primary purpose is to produce power. It is the largest producer of hydroelectric power in the United States, but it also has some interesting other missions, to include irrigation of the Columbia River Basin Project, assisting in flood control, simplifying navigation, and recently the dam has funded 3 fish hatcheries. When I say recently, I mean in the 1990s to present. Some of the impacts of the dam are pretty wide-ranging, but we are going to discuss specifically impacts to fish. Now, the Grand Coulee is part of a network of dams along the Columbia River. There are 14 along the main body of the river, but a total of 75 in that network of various tributaries that feed into the Columbia River. So this is a massive hydroelectric undertaking. Now, data pertaining to the direct impacts of specific species is difficult to find, especially when we're talking about the salmon that make their run up and down the river, because they are going through so many of those different habitats. It's difficult to determine exactly which species are encountering difficulty and where. It becomes very labor intensive. But some of those species are the steelhead, which I grew up fishing for and seeing in the rivers back home. They were on that slide previously. As well as Chinook and chum salmon. The Pacific Northwest National Library biologists have described a 96% survival rate required for downstream passages of fish along that basin as an incredibly complex and misleading statistic. So the 96% of fish that are required to survive when they're going out to sea, that's required for each individual dam. If it holds true and there's no other factors of attrition, and they go through, let's say, all 14 dams along the Columbia River, that means that a fish will have a 56% survival rate when it is smolting to reach the ocean if they pass through all those dams. Not to mention, if they originated in one of those tributaries that contains the dozens of other dams along their path. Now, there's different ways that fish may be able to swim downstream in their migration, different bypasses. You've got a spillway, you've got a surface weir, turbines, and a juvenile bypass system. We're going to talk about each of these a little bit more in depth, but here you have a graphic displaying each of these, where they're located on the dam from NOAA Fisheries. The juvenile bypass is a system that is implemented when a turbine is shut down. It's an alternate bypass method. A gate well, located here in the center of your screen, is used to intake fish. Initially, when gate wells were first introduced to dams, the fish were collected by hand and transported downstream, which became obviously labor intensive. Fish would not get caught or found. They would wait and stack up in the gate well and potentially die for inability to move, et cetera, et cetera. So now what's been implemented is an automatic system to feed fish downstream. The spillway is basically the face of the dam where you can see the water coming through regularly when they open it up. Conventional spill gates open at the bottom, as you can see in this graphic here. The problem with this is that most of the salmon in the river typically stay within the top 20 feet of the water column, whereas conventional spillways are a little bit deeper. It results in fish having a more difficult time finding the spillway. It results in fish just not being able to get there at all. It also could result in excess water being drained from the reservoir, and so it's ineffective. Here on the right, you can see a modification where the weir draws water from the surface. It makes those spillways, it's basically like a guiding gate for that fish to be able to find the actual spillway. According to NOAA Fisheries, quote, spillways can be the safest route for juvenile fish to pass a dam, but the spillway may be difficult for the fish to find. Most salmon and steelhead juveniles like to stay in the top 20 feet, like I was saying earlier, of the water column. Spillway openings may be as much as 60 feet below the surface, too deep for the fish to use. Beginning in 2001, some of the dams on the Columbia and Snake Rivers have been equipped with spillway weirs. These are movable gates on the upriver side, so think where the water is flowing from. When juvenile fish are migrating, water flows over the top of the weir and out through the spill gate. Since fish do not have to dive down to find the spillway entrance, more fish are passed with less water spilled. And since the fish quickly find passage, they also may escape predators above the dam. Now, one of the primary methods for fish to bypass a dam is turbines, which are notoriously deadly for fish. They can have pinch points. They're moving at typically rotations of about 60 to 70 rotations a second. 60 to 70 rotations per minute. So if you think of a giant turbine with these big blades turning at least once a second, and the fish has to get in there, right? A 6-inch fish that's trying to migrate downstream has to get in there without getting pinched, getting tossed around, all of that. It can be really deadly. Now what we're seeing is turbines with curved walls that reduce where the fish may be pinched, gates that are rounded, things that are helping the fish to survive that passage, as well as a different design in the actual output of the water from that turbine, which can help to reduce some of the turbulence experienced by the fish after they pass through the turbine itself. Still, disorientation from turbulence can make fish that pass through that turbine vulnerable to predation. So you think about it, you're a 6-inch fish, you go into this turbine, you get spun around, you get spit out the backside, you get disoriented, and now, a bird or other predator is more likely to be able to come down, snatch you up, whatever the case may be, because you're tired, you're disoriented. So the turbine is really not an incredibly effective method for trying to get these fish to be able to swim downstream. Some other factors at play here, and there's dozens with this dam and other dams in the system, but I'm going to try to keep it short for brevity here, is commercial fishing has been drastically impacted by the construction of this dam system. In the early 1930s, there were an average of 75,000 salmonids taken commercially in the basin per year. That practice is now illegal. There is no commercial fishing for these species permitted in the basin. The species is struggling to survive. There's 1,100 miles of habitat that's essentially inaccessible to them, or at least certainly restricted for them to be able to go spawn. Indigenous peoples have been impacted, not to mention the non-indigenous peoples, but over 2,000 indigenous people who were not represented in any of the decision-making process for the construction of the dam were moved. There were 2 towns that were completely displaced. One of the towns didn't have phone service for 30 years after the dam was constructed and the reservoir was built. They didn't have electricity. Serious impacts to local tribes, and then disruption of habitat for mammals. So the lake that was formed, the reservoir that flooded the area above the dam, destroyed lands that were necessary for the habitat of whitetail and mule deer, as well as bears, pheasants, mourning doves, and other mammals and birds. Part of their migratory patterns, part of their feeding grounds were in where that reservoir now sits. So it's a big disruption across multiple avenues of habitat, both aquatically and land-based. So ultimately, while the Grand Coulee is certainly an engineering marvel, like we touched on in the beginning, the consequences of its construction are generally irreversible and severe. I say irreversible because, yes, the dam could be destroyed and all of the dams on the river could be taken down in theory. In practicality, it's highly unlikely that that is going to occur. Even then, if it were to occur in the blink of an eye right now, the long-term effects would be incredibly lasting, and it's severe. It also has never actually achieved its full goal of in terms of acreage that was intended to be irrigated in the southern part, south central part of Washington State. It has certainly contributed to it, but looking at what they initially set out to do, it's fallen short consistently. Again, I'm Cody Waldrop. Thank you for looking at my presentation. References will be on the next slide. Have a good day.